"You'll forget her," the woman at the agency told me, gently, the way you would tell a child that a scrape will stop hurting soon. "Girls your age always do. You'll go on and have a whole life, and one day you'll realize you've forgotten." I was 19 years old, and I believed her, because I needed to. And I have spent the next 40 years proving, in the quietest and most private way a woman can, that she was wrong. I never forgot her, not for a single day of those 40 years. And I am telling you this now, out loud, for almost the first time in my life, because 3 weeks after my 60th birthday, an email arrived in my inbox with 2 words at the top of it: close relative. And the daughter I was promised I would forget walked back out of the silence and into my life. My name is Marilyn Foster. I am 60 years old, and I spent 35 years as a kindergarten teacher in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is its own kind of quiet ache when you think about it. A woman who spent her whole working life with other people's 5-year-olds. I am going to tell you what that DNA test found. But to understand what it did to me, you have to understand the 19-year-old girl, and the choice she made, and the 40 years she then carried it. It was 1985. I want to set you down properly in that year, because the year matters. The choice I made cannot be judged fairly from any other one. I was 19, in my second year of college, and I got pregnant. The young man involved disappeared the way frightened young men did and still do. And I was left, in 1985, a teenager, unmarried, with almost no money and a family whose shame about the situation was a physical presence in the house. There was no version of my life, in that year, with that family, in that town, in which keeping my baby was a door that stood open. I want to be clear about that, because for 40 years I was not clear about it with myself. It did not feel at 19 like I was choosing. It felt like I was being moved, by my family, and by the era, and by simple arithmetic, down a hallway with only one door at the end of it. And the door at the end was the agency, and the papers, and a pen. I want to tell you about my own mother in that year, because she is part of why the hallway had only one door. My mother was not a cruel woman, but she was a woman of her time and her town, and her time and her town had taught her that an unmarried pregnant daughter was a catastrophe to be managed quietly and quickly. She did not scream at me. What she did was worse, in its way. She spoke about the situation in a low, urgent, ashamed voice, always with the curtains drawn, as though the neighbors might hear the shape of it through the walls. She made it clear, without ever saying it outright, that there was the agency, and there was disgrace, and that those were the 2 options, and that only one of them let the family keep its face. I was 19. I had no money of my own, no husband, no way to live independently, and a mother whose every lowered word told me what a decent girl would do. I did not feel in that house like a young woman weighing a choice. I felt like a girl being walked, gently and inexorably, toward a pen. I held her once. The hospital, in 1985, was not sure whether that was wise, and neither was the agency. But a nurse with kinder instincts than the rules let me hold my daughter for a few minutes before she was taken to begin her real life with the people who would actually raise her. She had a full head of dark hair. She gripped my finger the way all newborns do, that blind, total grip. I have kept that grip with me, intact, for 40 years. The exact small pressure of it, the completeness of it. It is the only physical memory I was allowed to keep of her, and so I guarded it the way you guard the single photograph that survived a fire. For 4 decades, when people spoke of holding a baby, some private part of me went straight back to that grip, and to the truth I could never say in the room, that I had held my daughter exactly once, for the length of a few minutes, and had spent every year since living off of it. And then a woman in a cardigan took her down a corridor, and I signed what I was given to sign, and I was discharged 2 days later into the rest of my life. That is the moment. Everything in me has organized itself, for 40 years, around the few minutes of that grip and the sight of that corridor. No one prepares you for the silence afterward. I think I had imagined, in some childish way, that signing the papers would be like closing a book, that there would be a clean ending, a last page, and then nothing. It is not like that. I went back to my dormitory, and the world simply expected me to resume. There were classes. There were other girls my age worrying about ordinary things, and I moved through all of it with a wound that had no name anyone would say out loud, because in 1985, a girl in my position did not get to grieve openly. Grieving would have meant admitting there was something to grieve, and the entire arrangement depended on everyone agreeing there was not. So, I learned, in those first months, the skill that would define the next 40 years of my life. How to carry an enormous private grief while presenting an ordinary public face. I got very good at it. I got so good at it that eventually the people who loved me most never even suspected the grief was there. And then I did exactly what the woman at the agency said I would do, except for the forgetting. I went on. I want to tell you what going on actually looked like, because it is the strangest part. I finished school. I became a teacher. In my late 20s, I met a good man named Ed, and we married, and we had 2 children, a son and a daughter, and I loved them and raised them and built with Ed an ordinary, warm, decent 40-year life. And here's the thing I have to confess, the thing that has been the heaviest single fact of my existence. I never told any of them. Not Ed, not my son, not my daughter. In 40 years of marriage, I never told my husband that he had a stepdaughter somewhere in the world. The shame of 1985 had been pressed into me so hard by my family and by that whole tight-lipped era that I had sealed the baby away as a secret, and then I had simply never found a year, a month, a safe afternoon in which to unseal it. The longer I kept it, the more impossible telling became, because telling would also mean confessing the decades of not telling. So I carried her alone. For 40 years, I was a woman with a whole second life folded up inside her that not one person who loved her knew existed. For my 60th birthday, this past year, my children gave me a gift. It was one of those DNA ancestry kits, a little cardboard box, a plastic tube, a cheerful pamphlet about discovering your heritage. My daughter was excited about it. She wanted to trace the family's roots, find out what corners of the old world we had come from. It was a kind, ordinary, loving gift. And I sat at my own birthday table holding that little box, and I felt the floor of 40 years shift very slightly under my chair. Because I understood, holding it, exactly what that box could do. These kits do not only map old countries, they map living people. They find your relatives, and they find them whether or not anyone has been told those relatives exist. I knew, sitting there, that if I spat into that tube, I was opening a door I had kept shut for 40 years, and that I would not control what walked through it. I could have thrown the kit away. I thought about it. But I was 60 years old, and I had been carrying her alone for 4 decades, and some part of me that I had kept very quiet for a very long time was so tired of the silence. So one morning, while the house was empty, I opened the box, and I followed the instructions, and I mailed my secret away in a little plastic tube. I have thought about why I finally did it, after 40 years of keeping the door shut, and I think the answer is my age. Turning 60 does something. It is the birthday at which the arithmetic of the rest of your life changes, at which you stop being able to tell yourself comfortably that there is always more time, a later, a someday. I sat at that birthday table at 60 years old, holding that little box, and a quiet, clear thought arrived that I had never let myself fully think before. It was this: if I keep this secret, I am going to die with it. My daughter will be out there, and I will be gone, and we will have missed each other entirely, forever, and the silence I chose at 19 will have become permanent and total. 40 years of fear had kept the door shut. It took the cold clarity of 60 to make me see that the door would not stay there forever to be opened, that I was, finally, running out of someday. The email came about 3 weeks later. The subject line was ordinary and bright. My results were ready. And I sat down at the computer, alone in the house again, the way I had done everything concerning this for 40 years, and I opened it. And the website did what those websites do. It showed me my heritage, the percentages, the old world map my daughter had wanted. And then, below all of that, in its own little box, it showed me something under a heading that read, DNA Relatives. And at the very top of that list, Flagged in a color the site used for its strongest results were 2 words: close relative. And beside those 2 words was a name I had never heard, a woman's name, a first and a last. And beside the name, the relationship the test had calculated. It said, parent/child. I did not move for a very long time. The house was silent, and I sat there and I looked at the name of my own daughter, 40 years old now, with a last name given to her by the people who raised her, a whole human being with a whole life I knew nothing about. And I understood that she had also spat into a little tube at some point in some other house, and that she had done it, almost certainly, for one reason. She had been looking. My daughter had been out there in the world looking for me, and the test had just quietly, mechanically, introduced us. I want to tell you about the strangeness of seeing her name. For 40 years, my daughter had existed in my mind as a baby, a newborn with dark hair and a blind grip, frozen at the age of 2 days, because that was the only version of her I had ever been given. I had never been able to picture her growing, and now here, on a glowing screen, was a full adult name, a first name and a last name that strangers had chosen, and a life had worn smooth. The baby had a name. The baby was 40. The baby was a woman somewhere with a driver's license and a kitchen and opinions and a whole interior life I had missed every single day of. Seeing that ordinary adult name did something that 4 decades of grief had not quite managed to do. It made her real, real in the way a living, separate person is real. And I sat in that silent house and understood that I had spent 40 years grieving a baby when I should have been wondering about a woman. There was a button on the screen. It said I could send this person a message. And I sat with my hand near that mouse for what felt like an hour, because I understood that everything, 40 years of everything, came down to whether a 60-year-old woman was brave enough to click it. I want to be honest about the fear, because the fear was enormous, and it had 2 heads. The first head of the fear was her. What if she did not want me? Not really. What if she had taken the test for curiosity, and a birth mother climbing out of it was an intrusion? Or worse, the fear underneath that one. What if she did want to find me, but only to ask the question I had been answering in the dark for 40 years? How could you give me away? I did not know if I could survive being asked that to my face by the grown woman that baby had become. And the second head of the fear was my own family. Because clicking that button did not only mean reaching towards Sarah, that was her name, I would learn, Sarah. It meant that the secret was ending. It meant that Ed, my husband of more than 3 decades, was going to have to learn that I had kept this from him for our entire marriage. It meant my son and my daughter were going to learn they had an older sister, and that their mother had been a different woman than they thought. Clicking that button was going to detonate, all at once, the careful 40-year quiet of my whole life. I sat there and I understood that there was no longer any version of events where I got to keep everyone comfortable. The kit had ended that. The only choice left was which truth to step into. And there was a third fear, quieter than the other 2, that I am ashamed of and will tell you anyway. Part of me was afraid of what answering would say about the 40 years themselves. As long as the secret stayed sealed, I could tell myself a gentle story, that the silence had been necessary, that there had simply never been a safe moment, that I was a victim of my era. But the instant I clicked that button, I would be admitting that the door had been openable all along, that the only thing that had ever truly kept it shut was my own fear, and that the 40 years of silence had been, at least in part, a choice I kept making, every year, by not making it. Reaching for Sarah meant reaching past my own comfortable version of why I never had. It is a strange thing to discover, at 60, that one of the things standing between you and your own child is your need to not have been wrong. And then I thought about the nurse, and the corridor, and the grip of that newborn hand. And I thought about a woman, 40 years old now, somewhere out there, who had spat into a tube and was checking, every day, to see if anyone had appeared. And I found that after 40 years of choosing the silence, I could not choose it one more time. I clicked the button, and I wrote, with shaking hands, the truest and simplest thing I had, that I believed I was her mother, that I had thought about her every day of her life, and that I was so glad, so unspeakably glad, that she had looked. She wrote back in 4 hours. 4 hours! I have thought a great deal about those 4 hours. About Sarah, 40 years old, seeing the message appear, and what that must have been in her own house, 2 states away. Her message was careful and warm, and it was clear she had been preparing some version of it for a long time. She told me her name, and that she had been raised by 2 good people who had loved her and who had always been honest with her that she was adopted. She told me she had a family of her own now. And then she told me the thing that began, immediately, to dismantle the larger of my 2 fears. She told me she was not angry. She wrote, and I have read this sentence more times than any other sentence I own. She wrote, "I did not come looking to ask you why you gave me up. I came looking to tell you that it worked out and to see your face." She had not come with the question. She had come with an answer. I read that message perhaps 30 times in the first day, and each time I noticed something new in the care of it. Sarah had not written in the heat of discovery. She had written like a person who had thought for a long time about what she would say to me if this moment ever came, and what she had decided to lead with, before anything about herself, before any of her own questions, was reassurance. She had used her first contact with the mother who gave her up, not to demand an account, but to set that mother's oldest fear down. I learned later that this was simply who Sarah is, that she had spent her own years imagining me with a generosity I had never once extended to myself. She had pictured, not a woman who threw her away, but a girl who had been cornered. My 40-year-old daughter had been kinder to my 19-year-old self, for years, than I had ever managed to be. That humbled me before we had even met. We agreed to meet, 6 weeks later, halfway between her city and mine, in a quiet restaurant on a weekday afternoon. I told Ed everything before I went. I will come back to that, because it deserves its own telling. But I want to take you to the restaurant first, because the restaurant is the center of my life now. I got there early. I sat in a booth facing the door, the way I had once sat facing a hospital corridor, and I watched every woman who came in. And then a woman of about 40 came through the door, and she stopped, and she looked across the room at me. And I did not need the hostess, and I did not need a name. I knew her. I knew her the way you know your own face. She had my mother's chin. She had, I would find, my own laugh. And she crossed that restaurant, and I stood up, and my daughter, 40 years after a woman in a cardigan carried her down a corridor, put her arms around me. We did not say anything for a long time. There was nothing that needed saying that arms did not say better. 40 years. And then she was simply, warmly, solidly there, and the corridor, finally, after 4 decades, had another end to it. We sat down across from each other in that booth, and for the first few minutes, neither of us could do much but look. I kept finding myself, mid-sentence, simply stopping to study her face, cataloging it, the way you would study a photograph you had waited your whole life to be given. There was my mother's chin. There was, when she smiled, something around the eyes that was unmistakably my own. There were 40 years of a stranger's life written in small ways into a face that had started inside me. It is a feeling I do not have good words for. To look at a grown woman who is a complete stranger to you and to recognize her in your bones at the same time. She told me, later, that she had been doing exactly the same thing across the table, finding pieces of herself in my face, and that she had spent her whole life as the only person in her family who looked the way she looked, and that simply sitting across from someone she physically resembled was something she had not known she was starving for. We talked for 5 hours in that booth, and in those 5 hours, my daughter did something for me that I had not known any human being could do. She lifted the thing off me, the thing I had carried alone since 1985. Because here's what I had believed, privately, for 40 years, underneath everything. I believed that I had abandoned my child, that whatever the circumstances, whatever the era, the bottom line fact of me was that I was a woman who had given her own baby away, and that this made me, at my core, a kind of failure as a mother, no matter how well I raised the 2 children I kept. That belief was the engine of the 40-year shame. And Sarah, sitting in that booth, took it apart with her own story. She told me in detail about her life, about the two people who raised her, who could not have children of their own, and who had wanted her with their whole hearts, who gave her a stable, loved, supported childhood. She told me about her education, her work, her own children. She had, she told me, looking right at me, a good life, a genuinely good life. And then she said the thing that I have built my 60s on. She said, "A 19-year-old girl in 1985, with no money and no help and no husband, looked at all of that coming and made sure I got it. You didn't give me away. You gave me everything you couldn't give me yourself by handing me to people who could. That is not abandonment. I have spent my whole life knowing the difference." I asked Sarah, somewhere in those 5 hours, whether she had ever been angry at me. I had to ask. I had carried the dread of her anger for 40 years, and I could not leave that booth without knowing. And she was honest with me, which I have come to treasure more than any comfortable answer. She said that as a teenager, yes, there had been a stretch of anger. Not knowing the story, only knowing the bare fact of having been given up, she had gone through years of imagining a mother who simply had not wanted her. But she said that as she grew older, and especially once she became a mother herself, the anger had quietly dissolved, and something else had grown in its place. She said that the day she held her own first child, she had thought, immediately and overwhelmingly, of me, of a 19-year-old holding a newborn and then handing that newborn away, and she had understood, in her own arms, the scale of what that must have cost. "That was the day I forgave you completely," she told me. "Long before I ever found you. I just needed to become a mother to understand what kind of love it actually takes to do what you did. I want to tell you what those 5 hours did to 40 years of my own memory. Because I went back that night, and for many nights after, to the 19-year-old in the hospital, and for the first time in my life, I looked at her without contempt. For 40 years, I had judged that girl as harshly as a person can be judged. I had called her, in the privacy of my own head, a coward, a quitter, a girl who took the easy way. And Sarah's story made me finally see what that girl had actually done. That girl had been 19, terrified, and completely without options. And inside that hallway with only one door, she had not collapsed, and she had not made a bitter or careless choice. She had chosen, through her own heartbreak, the path that gave her daughter the best possible life. That is not what a coward does. That is one of the bravest things I have ever heard of a frightened teenager doing. For 40 years, I had been ashamed of the strongest act of my life. Sarah handed it back to me as something I was allowed, at last, to be proud of. I want to tell you about a small thing that broke this open for me, because it was not a grand realization, it was a tiny one. A few weeks after the restaurant, Sarah sent me a photograph of herself as a baby, one her adoptive parents had taken in her first months in their home, and I sat looking at that picture for a long time, at my daughter as an infant, safe and warm and clearly, obviously loved, in a nursery some other woman had decorated with care. And I realized that for 40 years I had only ever been able to picture the corridor, the woman in the cardigan carrying her away into an unknown. I had never once let myself picture where the corridor led. And it led here. It led to this photograph, this loved and bundled baby, this good beginning. The 19-year-old had not handed her child into darkness. She had handed her into that nursery, into those arms, into that life. I had spent 40 years grieving an ending and had never let myself see that for Sarah, it had also been a beginning, and a good one. I have to tell you about Ed and about my other 2 children, because the secret ending was its own hard chapter, and I will not pretend it was clean. I told Ed before I drove to that restaurant. I sat my husband of 30-some years down, and I told him all of it. The baby, 1985, the 40 years of silence inside our marriage. And I want to be honest, it hurt him. Not the baby. Ed is a deeply good man, and the existence of a child I had at 19 did not anger him for a moment. What hurt him was the 40 years. It hurt him that I had carried something that heavy in the same bed for our entire life together and never trusted him to help me carry it. We have had to work through that gently this past year. The fact that my shame had built a small, locked room inside our marriage that even he was never allowed into. I had not understood, until I watched it on Ed's face, that a secret kept inside a marriage does not only burden the keeper. For 30 years, Ed had loved a woman he believed he fully knew, and he had been, without knowing it, slightly wrong about her the entire time. There had been a whole continent of his wife that he had never been allowed to set foot on. He told me, quietly, that the hardest part for him was not learning the fact of Sarah. It was the retroactive ache of realizing that on all the days he had thought I was simply quiet, or tired, or far away, the days I now know were anniversaries, were her birthdays, were the bad ones. He could have been holding me through something, and had not even known there was something to hold me through. He grieved, a little, all the comfort he was never given the chance to give. That, I have come to understand, is the truest cost of a long secret. Not only your own loneliness, but every act of love the people around you never got to perform. But Ed, being Ed, came around to the other side of the hurt quickly, and what he said once he got there is something I will keep. He said, "Marilyn, I'm not upset that there's one more person to love. I'm only sorry you thought you had to be alone with her for 40 years. My son and my daughter, when I told them, were astonished, and then, fairly quickly, they were simply curious, and then welcoming. They have an older sister now. They have decided, to my endless relief, that this is a gift and not a wound. My daughter, my second daughter, the one I raised, said something to me, once the shock had settled, that I have held on to. She told me she was not hurt to learn she had an older sister. What had caught at her, she said, was something else. The realization that her mother had been quietly sad, in some deep and hidden chamber, for her entire childhood, and that she had never known it, never been able to do anything about it. She said, "All those years, Mom, you were carrying that, and you let us think you were just fine." And she was right, and it was hard to hear because it named the real cost of the secret. It was not only that I had been alone with my grief, it was that the people I loved had spent decades next to a sadness they were never given the chance to comfort. A secret, I have learned, does not stay neatly inside the one who keeps it. It quietly shapes the whole house, and everyone in that house lives, unknowing, beside its locked door. A year has passed now since the email with the 2 words. Sarah and I are building something, carefully, on the strange ground we were given. We cannot pretend to be a mother and daughter who shared 40 years. We did not, and that loss is real, and we let each other grieve it honestly. I missed her childhood. I missed her wedding. I am a grandmother to children who spent their early years not knowing my face. None of that is repairable, and we do not insult it by pretending otherwise. But what we can have, we are seizing with both hands. We talk every week. Our 2 families have met. My son and daughter have an older sister. My grandchildren have a grandmother who came late but came, and Ed has welcomed Sarah into our home with the easy warmth that has been the best thing about him for 30 years. We did not get 40 years. We get whatever is left, and we have decided that whatever is left is a great deal. There is a particular kind of afternoon that has become my favorite thing in the world, and I did not know to want it until I had it. It is the afternoon when both of my families are in the same house. Sarah and her children, and my son and my daughter and theirs, and Ed moving among all of them refilling glasses, and the noise of it filling rooms that were quiet for 30 years. For 4 decades, I lived as a woman split down the middle, with a whole secret family folded silently inside the public one. And now, on those afternoons, there is no fold. There is just one loud, oversized, slightly improbable family in one house, and a 60-year-old woman standing in the kitchen doorway, looking at all of them at once, whole for the first time in her adult life. I had thought, at 19, that I had to choose between my daughter and my life. It took 40 years and a cardboard box to show me that the choice had been false all along, and that, late as it was, I could finally have both in the same room. I keep the little cardboard DNA box. It sits in a drawer in my bedroom, the cheerful pamphlet still inside it. For 40 years, the most important object connected to my daughter had been a thing I did not possess at all. The memory of a corridor, an absence, a door closing. Now the object is a silly little box bought online for a few dollars, and it sits in my drawer, and it is the opposite of that corridor. It is the door that opened. I think about how close I came to throwing it away unused, how nearly I let 40 years of fear win one final time at my own birthday table. It is a sobering thing, to hold the small, ordinary object that you almost let keep your daughter from you, and to know how thin the margin was. My children gave it to me as a lark, a bit of fun, a way to color in some old-world map, and it turned out to be the key to the one locked room I had carried, alone, for 40 years. I look at it sometimes. An ordinary little box, bought as a birthday gift, that reached back 40 years and handed me my daughter, and, in the same motion, finally handed me back the frightened, brave girl I had spent 4 decades refusing to forgive. I want to leave you with the 2 things this taught me. The first is for anyone who is carrying an old shame, a choice from long ago that you have judged yourself for, privately, for years. I am asking you to do something I did not do for 40 years, to go back and look honestly at the situation the choice was actually made in. Not the situation as it looks now, from your safe and informed and grown-up present, but the real one, with the real walls around it, the real fear, the real absence of options. I spent 40 years judging a 19-year-old as a coward, holding her to a standard of choices she never actually had. When I finally looked at the hallway she had really been standing in, I saw that she had not failed. She had done a brave and loving thing in an impossible place. Your old self may deserve the same honest look. Do not let your safe present self keep sentencing a past self who was fighting for her life with the few tools she had. The second thing is about secrets and the loneliness they cost. The hardest part of my 40 years was not the choice I made at 19. It was the 4 decades of carrying it completely alone, of having a husband and children who loved me and never being able to let them help hold the heaviest thing in me. I told myself the silence was protecting them, protecting the peace of our home. It was not. It was only isolating me, and I learned, quietly hurting the people who would have wanted nothing more than to share the weight. If there is a locked room inside you that even the people closest to you have never been allowed into, I am asking you to consider that the lock is not protecting them. It is only keeping you alone in there. The people who truly love you do not want a comfortable, partial version of you. They want all of you, even the heavy rooms, even the old ones, especially those. If this story landed for you, drop the word match in the comments below. I read them. It tells me which stories are worth telling next. Subscribe for new stories, real patterns, full narratives, the long game. 2 small pieces of wisdom from this one before I go. First, judge your past choices by the room they were made in, not the room you are standing in now. It is easy, from a safe and settled present, to look back at a decision and call your younger self weak or foolish or cowardly. But that younger self was not standing where you are standing. They were inside the real walls of that moment, the fear, the pressure, the genuine lack of options, and they made the best move the few tools in their hand allowed. Before you sentence a past version of yourself, go back and look honestly at what they were actually facing. You may find you owe them an apology and a great deal of respect. Second, a secret carried alone does not protect the people you love. It only exiles you from them. We tell ourselves that our silence is a kindness, that we are sparing our family a hard truth. But a locked room inside you does not keep your loved ones safe. It only keeps you isolated inside it, often for years, often for no reason but old shame. The people who genuinely love you are not asking for the easy, edited version of you. They are asking for the whole person, heavy rooms included. Letting them in is not a burden you place on them. It is the thing they have been quietly waiting for all along. Forgive the girl who had no good choices. I'll see you next time.